Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky, August 1944. The medical ward smelled of antiseptic and summer heat. Ceiling fans turning slowly above rows of beds where wounded prisoners recovered from injuries sustained during transport or from illnesses that flourished in captivity as stress. In the corner bed, 23-year-old Elsa Hoffmann sat rigid with fear, watching lips move but hearing nothing, mouths forming words. She couldn't decipher orders. She couldn't follow a world of sound that had been stolen from her by artillery blast in North Africa. She had survived capture, survived the Atlantic crossing, but couldn't survive the isolation of deafness in an environment where missing commands meant punishment she couldn't predict or avoid. Then Lieutenant Margaret Sullivan, an Army nurse from Ohio who had learned sign language to communicate with her deaf brother, noticed the way Elsa's eyes tracked movement rather than sound, and everything changed. Elsa Hoffmann had been born with perfect hearing in Dresden in 1921. She had grown up listening to her father play violin, had learned piano herself, had experienced music and conversation and all the sounds that most people took for granted until they were suddenly, violently, permanently taken away. The deafness had come in Tunisia during the final chaotic days of the Afrika Korps collapse. Elsa had been a signals operator, not frontline combat, but close enough to danger that when British artillery had bracketed her position, she had been caught in concussive waves that had ruptured both eardrums and damaged the delicate structures of her inner ears beyond repair. The blast had thrown her against equipment that had knocked her unconscious, and when she woke in a field hospital, the world was silent. Not peaceful silence, not the quiet of a library or a snowfall, but absolute, terrifying absence of sound that felt like being trapped underwater or buried alive. She could see mouths moving, medics speaking to her, trying to assess her condition, but couldn't hear their words. She tried to respond, but her own voice sounded strange in her head, distorted by the damage to her hearing, and she couldn't tell if she was speaking too loudly or too quietly, or making any sense at all. The German medical personnel had been overwhelmed. Thousands of wounded, inadequate supplies, the impending collapse making treatment almost impossible. They had bandaged her head, given her basic care, and moved on to soldiers whose injuries seemed more immediately life-threatening. Deafness wasn't fatal. It just meant Elsa was now useless for military service and would need to be processed as a casualty and sent ... somewhere. Except there was nowhere to send her because German forces were surrendering and the entire logistics system was collapsing. She had been captured with a mixed group, soldiers too wounded to fight, medical personnel, civilian workers who had been attached to military units. The British had processed them efficiently, separated combat troops from non-combatants, and identified Elsa as signals personnel who had been injured in service. She tried to explain about her hearing, pointing to her ears, gesturing frantically, but the British soldiers didn't understand, and she could read lips in English, a language she had studied minimally before the war, but never mastered. The confusion had been terrifying. Orders shouted that she couldn't hear people grabbing her arms to move her places. She didn't understand. The constant fear that she would miss some crucial instruction and face punishment for disobedience. There was actually inability to comprehend what was being asked of her. A British medical officer had eventually examined her, had checked her ears and tested her hearing with instruments, and determined that she was profoundly deaf, likely permanently. He had made notes in her medical file, had tried to explain something to her through gestures and written English she struggled to read, and then had sent her along with other prisoners to whatever processing came next. The voyage across the Atlantic had been a nightmare. The ship's engines created vibrations she could feel through the deck, but couldn't hear, making everything seem surreal and disconnected. Other prisoners spoke to each other, forming social groups and support networks, but Elsa couldn't participate. She tried to lip-read German when people faced her directly, caught maybe one word in 5, enough to grasp general meaning, but not enough for real conversation. She felt herself disappearing. Without sound, without communication, without the basic human connection that language provided, she was becoming invisible, a body moving through space, but not a person participating in the social world around her. Other prisoners stopped trying to include her, not from cruelty, but from the simple exhaustion of attempting to communicate across a barrier neither side had tools to overcome. America revealed itself through visual splendor she couldn't appreciate properly because the expected soundtrack was missing. The harbor should have been full of sound ship horns, machinery, voices shouting across water. Instead, it was silent tableau, mouthing chaos she couldn't access. She watched America's abundance with the same isolation she had felt watching British processing, understanding through vision what she couldn't confirm through hearing. The train journey to Kentucky had been long. Elsa sat by a window, watching American landscape scroll past, occasionally feeling vibrations that suggested other prisoners were talking or singing or doing something that created sound she would never hear again. She slept poorly, woke from nightmares where she could hear again, only to discover upon waking that the silence remained, permanent and absolute. Camp Breckenridge materialized as clusters of wooden buildings sprawling across Kentucky farmland. The processing was familiar by now: photographs, fingerprints, medical examination. When the examining physician discovered her deafness through simple hearing tests, his expression showed concern. He wrote extensive notes, spoke to colleagues she couldn't hear, and eventually sent her to the camp hospital rather than to regular prisoner barracks. The hospital ward became her home, not because she was sick exactly, but because the medical staff didn't know what else to do. With a deaf prisoner who couldn't follow verbal instructions, couldn't participate in work details that required hearing orders, couldn't function in regular prison camp environment where communication was primarily auditory. She was given a bed in the corner, physically present, but socially isolated, watching the ward's activities, but unable to participate. Other patients received treatment, talked with nurses and doctors, complained about their conditions, or expressed gratitude, or maintained the social interactions that made captivity bearable. Elsa watched lips move and understood nothing, felt herself becoming more invisible with each passing day. The fear was constant. She didn't know the rules, didn't know what was expected, couldn't ask questions or seek clarification. When people approached her, she didn't know if they were giving orders or offering help or expressing anger at some violation she had committed unknowingly. The isolation was crushing, surrounded by people, but utterly alone, trapped in silence that was also solitary confinement of its own kind. 3 weeks into her time at Camp Breckenridge, Lieutenant Margaret Sullivan noticed something that others had missed. Elsa wasn't just quiet or withdrawn or traumatized in the ways that many prisoners were traumatized. She was deaf. Margaret Sullivan had grown up in Cleveland, Ohio, with a younger brother named David who had been born deaf. She had learned sign language as a child, not because her parents demanded it, but because she loved her brother and wanted to communicate with him properly, rather than relying on the limited lip reading and gestures that most hearing people used with deaf individuals. She had watched David struggle in a world designed for hearing people, had seen how his intelligence and personality were often dismissed because people couldn't communicate with him effectively. She had become protective, had advocated for him at school and in social situations, had developed sensitivity to the particular isolation that deafness created even when surrounded by people. When she joined the Army Nurse Corps, Margaret had not expected the childhood experience to be professionally relevant. She was trained to treat wounds, manage infections, provide care for soldiers who had been physically damaged by war. But arriving at Camp Breckenridge and being assigned to the prisoner ward, she discovered that medical skills alone weren't sufficient for addressing all the suffering she encountered. The German patients were recovering from various ailments: malnutrition, pneumonia, injuries sustained during combat or transport. Most were cooperative, grateful for the care they received, adapting to captivity with varying degrees of success. But one patient in the corner bed seemed different. She didn't respond to verbal instructions, didn't participate in ward conversations, watched everything with expression that combined fear and confusion in ways that troubled Margaret. Margaret observed her carefully over several days. The patient medical records identified her as Elsa Hoffmann, age 23, signals operator captured in Tunisia, would sometimes respond to written notes, but struggled with English vocabulary. She never reacted to sounds that drew attention from other patients, doors slamming, carts rattling, people speaking, unless they were directly in her line of sight. Her eyes tracked movement constantly, hypervigilant in ways that suggested she was compensating for missing sensory input. On the fourth day, Margaret tested her hypothesis. She stood behind Elsa and spoke her name loudly. No response. She clapped her hands close to Elsa's head. Nothing. She dropped a metal tray deliberately, creating sound that made every other patient in the ward jump. Elsa didn't react at all, didn't turn, didn't startle, just continued staring at the book she was holding. Though, Margaret noticed she wasn't turning pages, suggesting she wasn't actually reading, but using the book as shield against a world she couldn't access. Margaret walked around to where Elsa could see her and caught her attention. She pointed to her own ears, then shook her head in gesture that was nearly universal. Elsa's eyes widened with sudden understanding recognition that someone finally comprehended her situation. She nodded frantically, pointing to her own ears, then covering them with her hands, then spreading her hands in gesture of emptiness. Margaret sat on the edge of Elsa's bed and did something that made Elsa's breath catch. She raised her hands and began signing in American Sign Language. "Can you hear at all?" Elsa stared at the moving hands, processing. SL was an identical to the German Sign Language she had learned during her recovery period when other soldiers had tried to communicate with her through improvised gestures. But many signs were similar enough, or intuitive enough, that she grasped the meaning. She shook her head vigorously, then signed back in her own version of sign language. Nothing. All gone. Blast in Africa. The conversation was halting, limited by the differences between American and German sign languages, and by the fact that Elsa had never learned sign language formally, had only picked up fragments from well-meaning soldiers who tried to communicate with improvised gestures. But it was communication, actual two-way exchange of information, the first real conversation Elsa had experienced since losing her hearing. Margaret's face showed understanding and something like anger, not at Elsa, but at the situation, at the fact that this young woman had been isolated for months simply because no one had recognized her deafness or had tools to communicate with her. She gestured for Elsa to wait, then went to find the ward physician. Dr. Carson was an Army major, career medical officer who ran the prison hospital with competent efficiency. Margaret explained what she had discovered, that Elsa Hoffmann was profoundly deaf, that this explained her apparent non-cooperation and isolation, that she needed accommodation rather than just continued observation. Carson reviewed Elsa's medical file, found the British notation about hearing loss, and acknowledged he should have caught this earlier, but had assumed the notation referred to temporary hearing damage rather than complete deafness. "What do you propose?" he asked Margaret. Margaret had been thinking about this. Elsa needed communication tools, someone who could sign with her, written materials in German that explained camp rules and expectations, visual signals to alert her to meal times and ward procedures. She needed to be integrated into the prisoner population rather than isolated in the hospital, but that would require education for both guards and other prisoners about how to communicate with someone who couldn't hear. Carson was skeptical about feasibility, but authorized Margaret to develop an accommodation plan. "This isn't medical treatment exactly," he said, "but ensuring prisoners can understand rules and instructions serves medical purpose by reducing stress and improving compliance. Do what you think necessary, within reason." Margaret returned to Elsa with a small notebook and pencil. She wrote in English, "I will help you. "You are not alone. We will find ways to communicate." Elsa read the words, and for the first time since losing her hearing, she cried. Not from sadness or pain, but from overwhelming relief that someone understood, that someone cared enough to help, that the isolation might finally end. Margaret's first task was creating a communication system that would work within camp constraints. She couldn't change the entire prison facility to accommodate one deaf prisoner, but she could create tools that would let Elsa function with greater independence and less isolation. She started with written materials. Working with a German-speaking chaplain who visited the camp regularly, Margaret created simple documents explaining ward routines, camp rules, meal schedules, everything Elsa needed to know to navigate daily life without relying on hearing announcements or verbal instructions. The documents were illustrated with simple drawings that reinforced meaning and made information accessible even when language barriers complicated understanding. She taught Elsa basic survival signs adaptations of ASL that could convey essential information even to people who didn't know formal sign language. The sign for food was intuitive hand moving toward mouth. Sleep was hands together against tilted head. Medicine was thumb to mouth as if swallowing pill. Follow me was beckoning gesture. Simple, universal, understandable, even to guards and prisoners who had never encountered sign language. Then Margaret did something more ambitious. She proposed teaching basic signing to other staff and prisoners who regularly interacted with Elsa. The camp commander approved cautiously. It was an unusual request, but seemed reasonable given the circumstances and did not pose security concerns. If teaching sign language improved prisoner management and reduced confusion, it was permissible. Margaret organized brief sessions. She taught nurses basic medical signs, pain, nausea, breathing, heart, so they could check on Elsa without relying entirely on written notes. She taught guards simple command signs, stop, go, wait, come here, so they could direct Elsa during facility movements without frustration of trying to shout at someone who couldn't hear. Most importantly, she recruited other German prisoners to learn signing. Some were motivated by compassion. They had noticed Elsa's isolation and wanted to help. Others were motivated by boredom. Learning sign language was interesting activity that broke up monotony of captivity. A few were motivated by practical considerations. Elsa had skills they wanted access to, and communication with her required linguistic accommodation. The learning process was slow and imperfect. American Sign Language didn't map perfectly onto German thinking, and many prisoners invented hybrid signs that combined ASL with German Sign Language principles and improvised gestures that seemed intuitive. But imperfect communication was infinitely better than no communication at all. Elsa began emerging from isolation. She taught German prisoners signs she had learned, corrected their signing when they made errors that obscured meaning, and gradually built a small community of people who could converse with her at basic level. The conversations were simple about weather, food, families back home, but they were human connection that had been absent since her hearing loss. Margaret noticed change in Elsa's demeanor. The hypervigilant fear lessened. The rigid tension in her shoulders relaxed slightly. She began smiling occasionally when prisoners successfully signed greetings or shared jokes that worked across the language barrier. She was becoming a person again, rather than just a body occupying space in the ward. By September, Elsa was well enough physically to be moved from the hospital to regular prisoner barracks. Margaret advocated for placement with prisoners who had learned basic signing, creating a small integrated group who could communicate with her. The camp approved it was a practical solution that reduced security concerns about having prisoners who couldn't hear emergency instructions. The barracks assignment transformed Elsa's experience. She now participated in prisoner community, attended evening activities, played cards with women who signed their bids, and plays, contributed to conversations through combinations of signing and written notes that circulated among prisoners who wanted to include her. She wasn't fully integrated. The communication barriers remained significant, but she was no longer invisible. Margaret continued working with her, teaching more advanced signs, helping her develop fluency in a SL that could supplement the improvised signing that prisoners used among themselves. They met several times a week, sessions that were officially justified as medical follow-ups but functioned more as language instruction and emotional support. During one session, Elsa signed a question that had been bothering her. "Why are you helping me?" "I am enemy." "You should hate me." Margaret responded slowly, making sure Elsa could follow. "My brother is deaf. I know what it's like to be isolated, because people do and know how to communicate with you. That's not about being enemy or friend. That's about being human. Everyone deserves to be able to communicate. But you are American. I am German. We are at war." Margaret considered her response carefully. "Yes, we're at war. But you didn't start the war. You're not responsible for what your government did. You're just a young woman who got caught up in something bigger than yourself and got hurt. Helping you communicate doesn't help Germany win the war. It just helps one person not suffer unnecessarily." Elsa absorbed this, processing both the words and the philosophy they represented. The regime had taught her that enemies were absolute, that Americans would show no mercy, that captivity would be harsh and dehumanizing. Instead, she had found a nurse who spent her own time teaching sign language to enemy prisoners, who advocated for accommodations, who treated deafness as challenge to be addressed rather than as reason for exclusion. That evening, in the barracks, Elsa tried to explain to other prisoners what she was feeling. The signing was still rudimentary, but the meaning came through. She helps me because it is right, not because of countries or politics. This is different from what we were told about Americans. One of the other prisoners, a woman named Greta, who had learned signing partially because she found Elsa interesting, and partially because she was questioning her own beliefs about the war, signed back. "Everything we were told was lies." This is just one more example. The conversation continued halting, limited by communication barriers, but genuine in its exploration of how American treatment contradicted propaganda promises. Elsa participated fully, her hands moving in signs that conveyed thoughts and emotions that had been trapped inside her since losing her hearing. For the first time since the artillery blast, she felt like herself again, not just a body moving through space, but a person with thoughts and feelings and opinions who could share them with others. Winter brought cold that made the Kentucky barracks less comfortable, despite heating systems that worked far better than anything Elsa had experienced in military service. The prisoners organized activities to pass long evenings reading groups, craft projects, informal classes, where those with skills taught others. Elsa participated in all of it, communication facilitated by the growing number of prisoners who could sign at basic level and by her increasing fluency in reading English combined with writing German. Margaret continued her work with Elsa, but expanded the program. She trained new staff members in basic signing, created visual signaling system for emergencies, so Elsa could be alerted to fires or other dangers even without hearing alarms, and developed protocols for medical situations where clear communication with deaf patients was essential. The camp commander, Colonel Harrison, noticed the program's success and authorized expansion. If sign language instruction improved prisoner cooperation and reduced misunderstandings, it had security value beyond humanitarian considerations. He allocated resources for proper teaching materials, approved additional time for Margaret to conduct training sessions, and encouraged guards to learn at least basic signs for common commands and interactions. The program grew organically. Prisoners taught each other signs they learned from Margaret or invented through necessity. Guards who learned signing taught other guards. The camp began developing hybrid communication culture where signing supplemented spoken language, where visual communication was normalized rather than seen as accommodation for disability. Elsa found herself in unexpected role. She became teacher, showing others correct sign formation, explaining nuances of meaning that could be conveyed through hand shapes and facial expressions, helping people understand that signing was complete language rather than just gestures. She had purpose again, identity beyond the deaf prisoner. She was the person who understood signing best, who could help others communicate, who had valuable knowledge to share. By spring 1945, the signing community at Camp Breckinridge included maybe 40 prisoners and a dozen staff members who could hold basic sign conversations. Not all were fluent. Many struggled with complex ideas or abstract concepts, but they could communicate about daily needs, emotional states, simple stories and jokes that crossed linguistic and national boundaries. The war in Europe ended in May. News spread through the camp Germany had surrendered. The fighting was over. Prisoners would eventually be repatriated to whatever remained of their homeland. The prisoners received the information with mixed emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped. Grief for what Germany had lost. Fear about what they would face upon return that had been devastated by defeat and occupation. Elsa learned the news through signing. Margaret came to the barracks and conveyed the information with hands and facial expressions that needed no sound to communicate their importance. The war is over. Germany has surrendered. You will go home eventually. Elsa signed back. What will I go home to? I cannot hear. In Germany, there is no work for deaf people, no support. Here I have community who can sign with me. Home will be harder than prison. It was devastating realization. American captivity had paradoxically become more accommodating than German society would be for deaf women. Here, people had learned to communicate with her. Home, she would return to isolation, to a society that had no infrastructure for deaf individuals, to a nation rebuilding from ruins and unlikely to prioritize accommodation for disabilities when basic survival was challenge enough. Margaret understood the dilemma. She advocated with camp authorities, argued that Elsa should be among the last prisoners repatriated to give her time to prepare, that she needed resources about deaf support services in Germany, if any existed. The authorities were sympathetic, but limited in what they could do. Prisoners would be repatriated based on security assessments and logistical capacity, not based on individual accommodation needs. Through summer and fall, prisoners began leaving process, transported to embarkation points, shipped back across the Atlantic to Germany and uncertain futures. The signing community diminished as members departed, returning to a world where the communication skills they had learned would have limited use. Elsa remained, held back not for accommodation reasons, but because her medical classification required additional processing. The delay was bureaucratic accident, but it gave her extra months in environment where communication was possible, where she had community and purpose and human connection that would be difficult to replicate in post-war Germany. Margaret used the time to teach Elsa more advanced ASL to help her understand deaf culture concepts that went beyond basic communication, to provide her with tools for advocating for herself in situations where accommodation was unlikely. She also helped Elsa write letters to German deaf organizations, those that had survived the war, trying to establish connections that would support her reintegration. The two women became friends despite the barriers of language and nationality and the context of prisoner-guard relationship. They shared meals when possible, spent evenings teaching each other about their respective cultures, developed affection that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Margaret saw in Elsa the resilience her brother possessed, the refusal to let deafness define or limit identity beyond the practical challenges it created. Elsa saw in Margaret the kind of advocacy and support she wished existed everywhere, not just in one American prison camp during a unique historical moment. Elsa's repatriation orders came in December 1945, 18 months after her arrival at Camp Breckinridge. She would travel with one of the final prisoner groups, would be processed through displacement camps in Germany, would eventually make her way to whatever remained of Dresden and her family if they had survived. The final days were bittersweet. Prisoners who remained, a handful of women, with similar delays in processing organized farewell gathering. They signed stories and jokes, shared addresses and promises to write, acknowledged that the community they had built was temporary but meaningful nonetheless. Several prisoners had learned enough signing that they could have basic conversations with Elsa without Margaret translating, achievement that would have seemed impossible when Elsa had first arrived in her isolated fear. Margaret gave Elsa a gift book about American Sign Language with illustrations and German translations that Margaret had added laboriously in margins, creating resource that Elsa could use to teach herself more advanced signing or to teach others if she found community in Germany. She also gave her address in Cleveland, invited her to write, promised to respond and maintain connection across the distances that would separate them. Elsa signed her gratitude, hands moving with fluency that Margaret had helped her develop. You saved my life. Not from dying, from disappearing. When I could not hear, I was becoming invisible. You made me visible again. You gave me language back, gave me ability to be person rather than just body. I will never forget this. Margaret responded with signs she had practiced. You saved yourself. I just provided tools. Your strength, your willingness to keep trying despite isolation, that's what made the difference. Take that strength back to Germany. Use it to help others. Teach signing to anyone who will learn. Build community wherever you are. Don't let silence isolate you again. The departure was early morning. Prisoners loaded onto buses that would take them to processing center for eventual transport to ships and home. Elsa stood in line with her small bag of possessions, the signing book, letters from Margaret, a few items she had accumulated during captivity. She turned to wave goodbye to Margaret, who stood with other staff members watching the prisoners leave. Margaret signed across the distance. Good luck. Be strong. You are not alone. Elsa signed back. Thank you for everything. I will remember. The bus pulled away, and Elsa watched through the window as Camp Breckenridge diminished and disappeared. The place that had been prison, but had also been refuge where she had learned to communicate again and had found community despite deafness and despite being enemy in nation at war. Elsa Hoffmann returned to Dresden in January 1946, to a city so thoroughly destroyed by bombing that entire neighborhoods no longer existed. She found her mother alive, living in a displaced persons camp, but her father had been lost during the war's final chaos. Her younger sister was alive as well, though traumatized by experiences Elsa would only gradually learn about. She brought with her the signing book Margaret had given her, and she began teaching sign language to anyone who would learn other deaf individuals she discovered among the displaced populations. Family members who wanted to communicate with her, even some relief workers who recognized that communication with deaf refugees was challenge their organization needed to address. The work was difficult. Post-war Germany had limited resources for disability accommodation, and deaf individuals were often marginalized or institutionalized. But Elsa persisted, using skills and confidence she had developed at Camp Breckenridge, advocating for herself and others in ways that pre-war German society had not encouraged, but that American captivity had paradoxically enabled. She corresponded with Margaret for decades. The letters crossed the Atlantic regularly, Elsa writing in German with English phrases mixed in, Margaret responding in English with German attempts, both using their respective sign languages, vocabulary to describe experiences that did not always have simple verbal equivalents. They shared life milestones, professional achievements, personal struggles, maintaining connection that had begun in prison camp but evolved into genuine friendship. In 1952, Elsa helped found one of Germany's first deaf advocacy organizations in the post-war era. She taught sign language classes, advocated for educational opportunities for deaf children, worked to create community and support systems that had been absent before the war and during the Reconstruction period. She used methods and philosophies she had learned from Margaret, adapted to German context, but fundamentally shaped by that formative experience of having someone recognize her isolation and refuse to accept it as inevitable. In 1967, Margaret visited Germany for the first time since the war. She reunited with Elsa in Dresden, now partially rebuilt, but still showing scars of wartime destruction. They signed together for hours, catching up on lives that had diverged geographically, but remained connected through shared experience and maintained correspondence. Margaret met Elsa's family, saw the deaf community center Elsa had helped establish, witnessed the impact that one nurse, has decision to teach sign language had, multiplied across decades, and touched hundreds of lives. Elsa showed Margaret her treasured possession, the signing book, now worn and annotated with years of use, margins filled with additional notes and drawings from all the people Elsa had taught. "This book saved me," Elsa signed, not just as instruction manual, but as proof that someone cared enough to help. "Every time I was discouraged, every time I faced resistance or prejudice, I looked at this book and remembered that communication was possible, that community could be built, that isolation could be overcome." Margaret responded with tears in her eyes. "I just did what my brother needed people to do for him." But you took that small help and created something much larger. You built community, educated people, changed how society treats deaf individuals. That wasn't me, that was your strength and your vision. They embraced, two elderly women connected by accident of war and shared humanity, by one woman's deafness and another woman's knowledge of sign language, by refusal to accept that language barriers or national enmities should prevent human connection and mutual support. Elsa kept teaching until her death in 1983. She trained dozens of sign language interpreters, helped thousands of deaf Germans learn to communicate effectively, and advocated tirelessly for the accommodations and respect that deaf individuals deserved. She credited much of her success to lessons learned during 18 months of American captivity, to a nurse who recognized isolation and decided to build bridge instead of accepting silence as inevitable. The signing book fragile now, pages loose and cover worn, was donated to a deaf history archive in Hamburg. It remains there still, testament to how small acts of recognition and accommodation can ripple across decades, how enemies can become teachers, how one woman's compassion for a deaf prisoner changed not just that prisoner's life, but created community and support system that would outlast both of them and continue serving people who would never know the circumstances that made it possible.